Televiziunea Română, întâlnirile JTI și Fundația Art Production vă recomandă Garantat 100%.
Salutare! Bine v-am regăsit la Garantat 100%. Invitata noastră din seara asta s-a născut în 1978. Este jurnalistă și scriitoare. E fiica cea mare a celebrului Steve Jobs, cofondatorul uneia dintre cele mai mari companii producătoare de computere și terminale electronice inteligente din lume. Potrivit unor estimări din anul 2020, această companie valorează la ora actuală în jur de 2 trilioane de dolari. 1 trilion poate însemna 1 miliard de miliarde, dar în dicționarul explicativ al limbii române mai există o definiție. Spune așa: trilion, număr foarte mare, nedefinit. Cred că e mai bună definiția asta. Suntem onorați de această întâlnire în exclusivitate pentru emisiunea Garantat 100%. Îi spunem bun venit doamnei Lisa Brennan Jobs. Domnia sa este și autoarea unei cărți pe care o publică editura Humanitas la noi într-o traducere minunată, Small Fry, o poveste de viață și de familie. Lisa Brennan Jobs, hello. Thank you so much for accepting this invitation.
Hello, thank you for having me.
How are you?
I'm good. I'm hoping that the whole world can recover from COVID.
Right.
I'm in a sort of COVID haze.
Right. Lisa, thank you for your book. Your book is more than interesting. Your book is fascinating. It's quite normal. It's a bestseller. It'll be a bestseller in Romania as well. I'm pretty sure about that. But I will begin with a quotation. You said, "I don't remember the visit, but it was the first time I'd seen him since I'd been a newborn in Oregon. You know who I am?" he asked. He flipped his hair out of his eyes. I was 3 years old. I didn't. "I'm your father," like he was Darth Vader, my mother said later when she told me the story. "I'm one of the most important people you will ever know," he said. End of quotation. Well, Lisa, let's concentrate on this last phrase, "I'm one of the most important people you will ever know." Was he one of the most important people you ever knew, or was he the most important person in your life?
One of the fun discoveries while I was writing the book, and one of the interesting facts about my life is that the private and the public would dovetail and come together in this strange way. I think for everybody, their father and their mother are sort of the most important people they'll ever know. I think the point of writing a coming of age memoir is kind of reckoning with that fact, right? So yeah, he was my father. So he was definitely one of the 2 most important people I would ever know in a certain way. But then there's this extra layer on it of his public public persona, which makes him important to other people. But I actually don't think that's why he's important to me at all. I think the reason he's important to me is because he's my father, and it just happens that I share this sense of importance with a lot of people.
Will you allow me sometimes along our conversation to be the devil's advocate?
Certainly.
Okay, what would you answer if a virtual reader of your book could say something like this? The book is wonderful, really wonderful, beautifully crafted, a very good book. But Lisa Brennan Jobs is in a trend, and this trend is a universal one. People making money on their relatives, on the people who abused them sometimes, fathers, famous mothers, etc., etc. What would you answer?
So, first of all, the terrible truth is, if you want to write a book, especially like this one, which is a literary book,
Right.
you don't actually make that much money. It's a terrible secret. I started out with a larger publisher, and I was taking a while to finish the book because it takes a long time to write a memoir if it's going to be any good. Because find there's layers of feeling on, and then layers of facts, and then layers of feelings, and they're all buried in kind of, until you get through one, you don't get to the other. And so it takes a long time, at least it did for me, especially for a coming of age memoir, because you sort of, at first you have one story, and then you start to be skeptical of yourself, and then you realize, you start laughing at yourself a little bit more, and you realize that's not really the story. And by the end of writing something like this, you feel quite empowered. You feel as if you're onto yourself, I think. And so what happened is, anyway, my book was taking me so long to write, and my publisher was getting very antsy. They're a very big publisher. And I finally realized I needed to change publishers. So I changed publishers to a very small publishing house, a very small literary publishing house here called Grove. And it really was the most exquisite experience because they truly edit the book. They truly care about the book as itself. But of course, as a result, with all these things, right, you don't really get much money. So, especially with the small publishing houses. But I think the true catharsis really is to go through and make sense of your history. And you get this chance. There were times when I was very alone, both with my mother and my father. And of course, I grew up in California, so a lot of these times take place in cars, right? I mean, we're just driving around all the time. I live in Brooklyn, in New York now, and we're not in cars so much here. But in California, you're just always in a car. And so a lot of these experiences that happened both individually with my mother and individually with my father happened in cars. They were talking to me. And there was a sense of like, is this really happening? Is this strange, or is this me? Is this awful, or is this me? Right? And you get to write a book, and you get to go back and keep your little self company, right? Like writer me is sitting with little me in that car, and I'm not alone anymore. And I got to make sense of it both as the child and as the adult, and not feel so alone. So I think what's the bill of goods that's sold to us is that money will solve things. And I don't know, maybe it does, but I would say, and certainly past a certain level, right? But I would say for me with this book, what made it so important for me is that I could make true sense of what had happened to me. No longer feel like either a victim or a perpetrator. No longer feel so ashamed.
We'll get there. Because I'll ask lots of things about that.
I would say making sense of someone who has both delighted you and harmed you. It gives you a new life, and I don't just think that's my father, although obviously people are more interested in him because they in some ways know him, but that's also my mother. And I don't think I'm unique in that. It's almost like probably everybody should write a memoir, but we don't all have time. So I've tried to really write it fully so that some people don't have to write theirs and they can live a little bit through various experiences in mine. I would say it would be a triumph of mine if people would read it and say, gosh, I assumed it would be about Steve Jobs' kid, but actually I felt my own story in this story. In the end, that wasn't so relevant.
Your father is not any father. I mean, he is the co-founder of a company which is worth now around, I don't know, $2 trillion or something like that. He is a personality in the history of mankind. So your father is not quite a normal father, I would say. But I
would say he's normal to me as everyone else's father to them. So it's a strange disconnect. Like for you, he's this, but for me, he actually was just my father.
Yeah, I can figure that. Yep. Let's talk a little bit about a very delicate notion, which is a sort of a judgmental process, a very special one. By telling the story of your relationship with your family with such a degree of intimacy, you somehow push or allow the reader to be judgmental, to have an empathic feeling towards you, and to somehow put a blame, a hard one sometimes, on your father. Was this an intention? Was this inevitable? How was this?
I think people are used to maybe like tell-all memoirs, and this really isn't. But if you're going to do a memoir, you inevitably reveal the humanity of your characters. So, and I really, honestly, I did not want to do a memoir. That just sounded like the most horrible thing to have to do a memoir, but I just kept on returning to it because I couldn't somehow write other things. I couldn't somehow feel free in my own life until I had made sense of these things in the past. I don't know if I feel like in some ways, my father's been portrayed a bunch of different ways. I mean, I don't even know all the ways he's been portrayed because I don't watch everything. But one thing that surprised me about the reception of this book was that people were like, he was mean sometimes. And I thought, well, everybody already knows that. That's everywhere. That's public knowledge. I don't think that my book had anything new in that realm. I think the only difference is probably that until that meanness is set against a young child, other people, maybe people somehow weren't willing to believe it or something, or they weren't willing to believe it had an impact or it really mattered. And who knows? I mean, who knows what really matters, because public and private life are so separate, and my father made amazing things, and in many ways he was a good father. So I'm not exactly sure. It's not my job, and I don't necessarily feel certain about being the arbiter of how to be a parent or how to be a person. But I certainly felt that it was important to write a real memoir, which means you have to write it like it was, and people aren't so they're not so consistent, and they're not so perfect, especially when they're doing one of the hardest things ever, which is parenting, right?
Right.
So I say that with experience. I have a toddler.
Lisa, fundamentally, what was the main drive that made you write this book? I mean, the main drive inside you. What made you say at a certain moment, I'm going to write this?
I felt like I was dragging myself kicking and screaming toward it for a very long time. So I was already writing, but yet I felt like, oh, I don't want to write a memoir. I want to write something else first. I've always been a writer. And I felt that if I didn't write this, that there was other work I could do that it wouldn't get done. If I didn't sort this out in a way that felt urgent and important, then I wouldn't get to other writing work and other work in my life that I really wanted to do, because I would be, in some small and large ways, still living in my own past. There's this feeling that you're repeating things it's like the biggest cliche in the world, right? That if you don't come to terms with your own past, then you repeat it. And I think it's a cliche about world history too, which is why it sounds a little bit grandiose here. But I think if you don't come to terms with certain elements of your own past, you do repeat them in your own life. And I not only wanted to have a life that was my own choice, that if I wanted to repeat something, I chose it. I didn't do it by default for my family and for my friends. But I also wanted to have a life that was somehow free of some of the confusions and misconceptions and almost incredible shame that a lot of us carry around from childhood, and be free of that so that I could do other work. And I think it's important for me to be able to get the chance to do my work too. And so in a certain way, it's like the most incredibly selfish thing to do, to decide that sorting through my own past was worth it. I mean, I'm just like this ancillary character to this world star. What gives me the right? But what gave me the right was that if I didn't do it, I wouldn't be able to have my own life.
Lisa, I think it's very honest to say that our viewers should know that. It's early in the morning in New York, and I'm very sorry that I got you up with these questions in this morning, which is a grim morning in New York, and you had to wake up and face this type of questions. But you've been kind enough to answer, so I'll go on. There's a quotation also. There were the Reagan years, and Reagan had denigrated single mothers and welfare mothers, calling single mothers welfare queens taking government handouts so they could drive Cadillacs. And later, she talked about how Reagan was an idiot and a crook and had designated ketchup a vegetable in school lunches. End of quotation. I was just thinking of the fact of how was your mother in those days? I mean, those were hard days for a single mother growing up a child. How was she during all that time?
So I have a child now. I have a toddler, and we have enough money. He has two parents. We have work that we enjoy doing, so we're creatively satisfied, or as satisfied as a writer can ever be. But I literally cannot imagine what it must have been like to be a young single mother from a difficult family with no money and no support, who was walking around feeling very ashamed. I cannot. I think people go through so much. And I certainly understood how hard it would be to be a single mother in some ways while writing this book. But after having a child, I had a child right around when I published the book, who's almost 3 now. I have a new understanding of what it would be like to be sort of food insecure young mother. I can't even. So she was, I think though, what we have to think about is almost like in the book, the narrative arc of her character, right? I mean, because it is a literary work, you see people from early on, and then you see them all throughout time. And I think what you see with my mother is that she's going through incredibly hard times, and she's trying her best and often failing. And she has a temper, and she came from a really hard household herself in some ways. But you see that she's always trying to do a very good job. You see that she's always, that she sort of continuously keeps on trying to show up. Right. And so that's a kind of beautiful thing. I mean, I was 39 when I had a child, and she was 23. I mean, it's unimaginable. Like, also when I was writing the book, I would spend whole days writing for years. And then I would go for a run, and then I would sleep as much as I needed to and write the next day. I mean, it's very hard. I think this has been very well documented, but it's very hard to be an artist and to have a child. And the frustration when you're an artist and you don't get to express yourself because your life is consumed with these tasks that are so minutia based around children that they just sap your creativity. I think the rage and frustration of women who go through that is incredible. It sort of simmers under the surface all the time, I think. So I think she's kind of an amazing character in the book. I mean, it's like in a book you're only able to capture as much as you can capture of someone, right? All the characters that are mentioned in the book are actually whole people. but I felt like I was able to show her as a good and complex person.
There's also a quotation, and it sounds like this. How much money does he have? I asked my mother a couple of years later. See that? my mother pointed to a ripped bit of white paper the size of a pencil eraser. That's what we have. And see that? She said, pointing to a whole roll of white craft paper. That's what he has. End of quotation. At that moment when you were so young, when you were so little, were you ever thinking of the unjust situation you were in? You had a very wealthy father and you had a very hard living with your mother because you had no money. Were you thinking in terms of justice and ethics and things like that? Were you talking with your mother about that?
Well, let's also talk about, this is not a memoir of suffering, right? I went to a sort of amazing private school in an enchanted forest, sort of Hogwarts West. I had a therapist that was paid for, who was a wonderful man when I was starting at age 8 all the way through. My college tuition was ultimately paid. I was in you talk about the weather here and in Romania this morning or in Romania this afternoon, and in New York this morning, and it's gray and bleak outside. And I grew up just surrounded by emerald forests and sunlight. It was so exquisite. The Bay Area is so exquisite, all the time. It feels magical. So this is not a memoir of suffering, really, but there were obviously hard times. I think that money, again, we're talking about money. I think it's a very abstract concept. I think what I really, really wanted was to feel like all children just, obviously I wanted all the toys to show off and have fun with, but I don't think that was the main driver. I wanted to feel like I was loved and worthy of love. And I think the other thing I did, a feeling that I hadn't realized I was carrying with me all the time was a feeling of being really ripped off. My father was adopted. And I think in some ways, maybe he had felt a little bit ripped off. I don't know. But I felt, in writing the book, I discovered that I'd felt just ripped off. I didn't get what other kids were getting. And it wasn't really about money. It was about a sense of, being loved by two parents and having all the normal things, right? So, and that feeling of being ripped off was with me all the time. And it was important to write the book to sort of uncover how that was underneath. It was a kind of theme underneath everything. This feeling, but I think money, it would be great if it was just money, but money is the simple answer. I think it was more complicated than that. I wanted to feel the way I saw other children seem to feel, which was, complete and loved and normal.
Talking about ripped off, here's what you say. This was around the time the story came out, The Machine of the Year, about my father and computers in Time magazine in January 1983, when I was 4, in which he'd hinted that my mother had slept with many men and lied. In it, he talked about me, saying 28% of the male population of the United States could be her father. It's pretty obvious how your mother felt it in the book. How did you feel it?
Well, I was too young then. So there's a certain point in the book.
So you were 4.
The book is not expository, right? It's in scenes. You read about this happen. As the reader, you're sort of immersed in the moments. But I did have to take a little moment fairly early on in the book and just say what happened. And that's part of that sort of area in the book, just a kind of essay to say, this is what happened, this is what happened. But I wasn't aware of these things then. I was too young. I was only
you were 4.
3 or 4 when that magazine article came out. I just remember my mother, I do remember at the time quite distinctly going into the kitchen. We were living in Tahoe and the lights were out and my mother was moving in slow motion and I knew something was wrong. And I think she just read that article. She said that she had been hoping that he cared how much she was being a good parent to me. And then reading that article, it just felt, I think, like the rug was pulled out from under her. But these are all her words. I don't really know. I didn't feel anything at the time. Again, what you want as a kid is you want your parents and love. And so, and a feeling of belonging and maybe normalcy. So that was the only thing that I can relate to about that time, was just that, that my mother wasn't happy.
Here's another quotation. That night, I wrote in my journal that I loved my dad. Then I clarified, not Ron, Steve Jobs. Underneath the name Steve Jobs, I wrote, I love him, I love him, I love him. I felt it there inside my chest, like my heart would rip apart with it. End of quotation. So this is so intense. This is the word. This is so intense.
My aunt wrote something really brilliant in her book. In one of her books, she wrote, all you have to do to be a god, all you have to do to be someone's god is disappear. Right? So I think there was just this quality of his intermittence and his glamour, and this feeling of dreaming and wishing for this almost deus ex machina, where the god is lowered down on the crane or whatever it is.
From somewhere, yes.
And save the story, right? And he seemed so capable of being that kind of story-saving god. He drove a Porsche, and he was tall, and he had fancy clothes, and being around him felt exciting. So even though, of course, he was not going to be that person, because no one can be that person, he had the quality of magic for such a young child.
So you say, I love him, I love him, I love him so many times. But at the same time, what you feel and what you repeat many times, it was not enough. It was not enough. It was not enough. Please tell me about that.
Yeah, I think there was just a feeling of, if you've waited for someone your whole life to come and save you, and then they come and they're just a human being, it's disappointing. And how do you reconcile this love and this feeling of magic with this terrible, unavoidable feeling of a kind of dawning realization that this person can never be enough to save you and to rectify what you lost. I sometimes think, isn't it true that like the people that seem to hold the promise of being saviors are sometimes the least capable of being saviors, and the sort of ordinary people who don't seem as if they could save you at all are really the sort of real saviors, kind of. But I think that, I guess what we were talking about in the beginning of the interview, I was saying something about how my father, the public perception of my father was as this kind of hero god, and that the private perception of any young child's father, especially one who's been gone, is of a kind of hero god. And so there's this, I didn't relate to him as the public relates to him. I don't really care if he's famous. If he hadn't invented iPhones but had spent 2 more hours with me, I would have been happier, right? So in fact, my wishes in my private life are almost in direct contradiction with the public's wishes, right? But it's just funny how we almost maybe perceive famous people as kind of saviors. We almost perceive famous people, or at least it seemed to me my father might have been perceived this way, as a kind of as a young child perceives a missing father. It's such a similar feeling of like, you will save me. But in my case, he was just a person who was wounded like other people and who hadn't really been able to be there for me when I was younger because of he was young and his own issues. And when he came back and tried, he really did try. But of course it wasn't really enough because he'd been gone for so long and he didn't really know how to love me. So it was both exciting and magnificent and magical, and also at the same time, somewhat disappointing.
If you have to answer, yes, a question without nuances, although the whole life has nuances, but if you have to answer this, what would you say if the question is, was your childhood happy or not?
I would say happy. I would totally say, just because I think I was temperamentally happy. I think you could have plopped another child into my life and they might have been miserable. I was just a happy kid. And again, sunlight.
Okay.
I tell you in the dead of winter, having so much beautiful sunlight in nature really goes a long way.
I'll give you another quotation from yourself, which is really wonderful.
Oh no, you're quoting me to me?
Just hear it.
Okay.
Quote, a few minutes later, as we got into the residential streets, farther away from the main street of the town and closer to my house, he farted. The sound loud and high, like a balloon opening, interrupting the silence. He kept skating like nothing happened. When he did it again, I looked away. After the third time, he muttered, sorry. It's okay, I said, mortified for him. End of quotation.
It's such a kid thing to be mortified by parents and any sort of embarrassment, right? But he was always doing these crazy fasts. So he would eat carrots for weeks and then turn orange, or he would, I don't know. I mean, he was definitely trying to use food, I guess, as lots of people have used it in the history of the world, to be a kind of portal to more creativity or more spiritual awareness. But that resulted in some flatulence, I would say. I think also it's what it's me as a writer and as a person probably flexing my muscle, right? Like saying, look, I know that this is a famous person to you, but this is my father and he was human and this is my human story. So you have to take it that way. It's a human story. Yep. And it's the highest praise for me would be if you read this book and say, oh my God, I completely forgot it was about Steve Jobs. I was consumed with the people, with the story of three people. So I think it's me sort of getting to tell, like deciding that I get to tell the story of my family, even if my father happened to be a public figure, I have the right as his daughter to tell the story of our lives together. And I think that's a very dramatic example of me being like, and I'm going to say it like it was. The other funny thing about books is you don't realize this when you're reading often, but you can just, like, if you have even just one scene of someone going skating and farting, it almost stands for so many scenes. You only need one or two scenes. I mean, my father and I went skating so many times together, but I can't just regale you with skate after skate. It's almost like I write one scene or maybe two of us skating and you get the picture. I also had a bunch of friends, because I had friends, lots of friends in high school. And earlier on, these friends were all in the book. And someone read the book and said, oh, it suffers from the same problem a lot of memoirs do. There's just a bunch of people at the end and you don't know who they are and you almost don't care. And so in the end, I basically have one or two friends. I think you meet one or two friends in the whole book, but you don't get a feeling like she didn't have any friends. Books work on these strange skeleton rules. You have to use one little piece to stand for a whole. And then the reader gets a feeling of reading about a whole life. But of course, they just got a tiny piece of it.
Lisa, your father, Steve Jobs, said people who aren't born here, and he meant California, they just don't get it. What's the meaning of that?
I think just the sort of the immense beauty of the place.
Uh-huh.
I mean, I don't even think he was talking about Southern California. I think he was talking about Northern California, a sort of magical light and spiritual vistas. I mean, the Native American Indians who lived there, it was like, because the food, as far as I understand, the food was fairly plentiful, the acorns from the oak trees, and the climate was fairly temperate. And so they would walk barefoot all around those hills. And they weren't fighters so much. I think they fairly peacefully inhabited the land, as far as I understand. I think there's just, when I moved to the East Coast, I called him in college and I said, I can't see any distance. It was like I would look out every window and all I would see was another building, or maybe I would see the river and then a little bit of land, but I could never see this massive vista of hills as far as I could see. And I think there's a kind of exquisite nature, not so hemmed in by man-made things, and large vistas, and when you get a sense of that beauty in your bones, I think maybe you can be more creative, or maybe you can be more less formal, less pretentious. I don't know exactly what he was saying, but there is a kind of formality on the East Coast of the country, which is nice in its own way. But the informality and the creativity that comes from the West Coast, I mean, I think it's unequaled in my experience.
Lisa,
or maybe that's what he was talking about. The whole future, like the technological future is kind of happening right there, that we are all, living with, suffering under currently. So maybe in some ways he was talking about some quality in the land that is conducive to that kind of creativity.
Lisa, you yourself and other people, you kept on asking Steve Jobs if his first computer, which was named Lisa, was named after you. And the answer was a constant no. It had to be Bono in person who obtained the answer, who got the answer. Your father said yes, but it had to be Bono asking the question.
Or my father was more relaxed then. I mean, I don't know what it was. I was so annoyed about that. I was so annoyed about that story because, of course, it just sounded kind of douchey. I mean, I know because of chance a fair number of famous people who did not appear in this book, because it is not a book about that. But in this case, I just kept on asking him, and I guess it felt like if he told me the computer was named after me, then in some way it meant that all the time that I was missing him, he was missing me too. That it was a big misunderstanding, that he just couldn't reach me, that he wanted to love me, but he couldn't love me in the normal way, so he named a computer after me. So I think there was this, or that it would mean I mattered to him. So I kept on asking him. I would ask him, all throughout my childhood, and I would brace myself, like, maybe this time he'll say yes, but he'll probably say no, because if he said no, the computer is not named after me, it basically meant you don't matter to me. You didn't matter to me then. You might matter to me now, but you didn't matter to me then. And I was just, so that was the subtextual conversation we were having over and over again. Did I matter to you then? And he would say, no, sorry, no, right? Over and over again. And my mom, when I talked to her about it, she said, of course it was named after you. Like, who else? And then he said, oh, I had an old girlfriend named Lisa. And I told my mom, well, he had an old girlfriend. And she said, no, he didn't. I knew him his whole life. He did not have a girlfriend named Lisa. But I didn't believe her. I thought she was just the loser he'd cast aside, the way teenagers can think of their mother, probably an exaggerated version of that. And then it was at some point we went to have a lunch with Bono, and Bono, I just asked him, and I braced myself for him to announce to the whole lunch of people, including Bono, that I didn't matter to him. And then in fact, the answer changed. He said, yes, it was. And I thought, oh, of course it was. Of course it was. But it's so funny. It's like, those things in life that you desperately want so much. And then when they finally happen, they seem so obvious, or like maybe they don't matter anymore. It's like some rule of life that you don't always get what you want when you feel you need it. Sometimes it happens later. Sometimes you get the answer later when you don't care anymore.
Lisa, in his last days, when he was very ill, your father, Steve Jobs, told you many times, repeatedly, he told you, I owe you one. I owe you one. I will not ask you about money, it would be ridiculous. But did he pay his debt?
I don't know. I sometimes feel like that he wouldn't have really wanted me to write a memoir. And so I think, okay, I'm going to take this. I needed that. I needed the chance to be able to sort through all my feelings in the past and all the stories and to share them. And so sometimes I think, okay, you owe me one. You owe me the chance to write a memoir, which you probably wouldn't have liked. I don't know. I'm not saying he wouldn't have liked the book. I'm just saying he wouldn't like the fact of it. But it's a really powerful thing. I mean, there's always that scene in Hollywood movies where the dying person apologizes to the living person and says things that they never said in the rest of their life. But it seems like such a Hollywood trope that never really happens in real life. And it was really amazing that he apologized. It felt like I had assumed that he'd been pretending a lot. And then finally he said, no, I didn't. I wish I'd spent more time with you. I love you so much. And now I don't have enough time. And I just, I don't have any more time. And he was crying and he said he owed me one. And it just, that feeling I talked about earlier of being ripped off. And it just felt a little bit like a balm on that wound. Like I felt a little bit more like this. The truth that was my truth was the truth that was his truth. And I could stop fighting and I could rest a little bit. And I felt, I guess, having his apology in such a profound way over a series of days, I didn't even know how to take it in, but having such an apology made me feel, I guess, more peaceful, less like I was ripped off, more like, I got to move on from the story, which is the goal, right? You want to move on into your adulthood away from your childhood. So I don't know about the debt. It was such a strange phrase, I owe you one. What a strange phrase. But it certainly felt good. It certainly felt good that he cared about me enough to really take the time to apologize so profoundly before he died. I wish he'd done it earlier because then we could have had more fun. But
do you feel like you moved on?
Well, I'm right now we're talking about the book, but so much. Yeah, I do. Although I'm in a haze of a young family right now. So that's so all consuming that I think anyone in my position would feel they'd moved on. Yeah, there's been a lot of peace.
Thank you so much. I'll say a few words in Romanian and then I'll come back to you.
Okay.
Recomand din tot sufletul o carte care se citește de la un capăt la altul, ținându-ți răsuflarea, deși nu e o carte de acțiune, e o carte extrem de spectaculoasă. e vorba despre cineva care își expune cu enorm de mult curaj viața personală. Și nu e o viață personală tocmai ușoară. Nu e vorba de cineva care trăiește greu material, ci e vorba despre cineva care are o problemă interioară de mare greutate. Recomand cu mare căldură Small Fry, o poveste de viață și de familie de Lisa Brennan Jobs. Lisa, thank you so much for accepting this invitation. Keep up the good work and yes.
Thank you so much. I couldn't understand the Romanian, but I think you said some nice things. Thank you.
Thank you too. All the best, Lisa.
Thank you. All the best. Take care. Okay.
Tuturor celor care sunt alături de Garantat 100%, mulțumim frumos pentru încredere. Ne vedem săptămâna viitoare. Noapte bună!